Hello, my name is Ray, and I was encouraged to make this by my grandson Alex. He's in college and he wants to pursue a degree in counseling and hopefully have his own private practice someday. So again, my name is Ray, and my credentials are that, let's see, I have 2 bachelor's degrees and a master's degree from the University of Minnesota in mental health counseling. I was in private practice for 42 years. In addition to that, I also had the good fortune of being able to be instrumental in the creation and marketing of 3 inpatient treatment centers for trauma. One was in New Mexico, one in Texas, and one in Arizona. I was also, on the lecture circuit for about 3 years doing presentations on chronic trauma, PTSD, dissociative disorders. I've done literally hundreds and hundreds of trainings of other professionals. So I have a great deal of experience for this, with this. And the most effective therapy that has been found so far for post-traumatic stress disorder and chronic trauma is cognitive behavioral therapy. And what that involves is 15 different cognitive distortions that can cause a tremendous amount of difficulty for us. I'm also a Vietnam veteran. I started working with PTSD in 1980 before we even had a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. We didn't know what it was that we were working with, but we knew that a lot of these Vietnam veterans coming home were pretty beat up and banged up psychologically. So that has been the focus of my entire career, is working with trauma. So what I'd like to do on this series is, I'm not going to go into PTSD too much. What we're going to do is focus on the cognitive distortions that cause so much misery in people's lives. So we'll begin with this, that we need to understand that our emotions do not come from events. Our emotions do not come from situations. Our emotions are not created by other people, like, you make me so angry. It's like, no, I don't. You're making yourself angry. And so the reason that there's so much difficulty for trauma survivors of chronic trauma, be it combat, be it rape trauma, be it child abuse trauma, domestic violence, is the confusion that causes and the hurt that it can cause. And so there are 15 major cognitive distortions, and then there's other ones as well. But we're going to focus on the 15. We're going to take them one at a time and kind of go through them and give you an overview of how these cognitive distortions, or thought disorders, if you will, operate, and how they can keep us stuck in the emotional environment of the trauma. So that's what we're going to focus on in this series of lectures. So we'll begin with the worst one. I think that the worst cognitive distortion that causes the most pain and suffering for us is the cognitive distortion of should. Now, the reason that distorts reality so badly is because should is only appropriate in a limited number of places. One of them is in math. In other words, if I had 5 of these and 5 of these, I should have 10. And that's valid. And in physics. So if I let go of this, it should fall towards the center of the earth. It's not that I would prefer it to, it absolutely should. But when we start using should in different places, it can cause an emotional amount of pain and suffering. So we'll begin with that one, and then we'll move on to the other ones. But let's stay with the shoulds for now. So when we use a should and we direct it at others, the emotions that are created by that distortion of reality is feelings of anger, resentment, and frustration. And out of anger, frustration, comes entitlement. So, for example, if you should have done what I wanted you to, and you didn't, then I have the right to be angry with you. So should becomes like a Jehovian mandate. So, for example, if I were to imagine this, a single mom is coming home after a long, hard day. The kids haven't cleaned up the house. They haven't done the dishes. They haven't done anything. And the mom comes in the door, looks around and says, "Damn it, you children should have cleaned up this house. You should have gotten your toys picked up. You should have done the dishes." What she's going to feel out of that is anger and resentment and frustration. And out of anger and resentment and frustration comes entitlement. For example, if I'm working with a perpetrator of domestic violence, which I've worked with a lot of them, and I would say to them, okay, well, Sally's in the hospital. She's got a broken jaw, 2 black eyes. You're looking at a felony assault. And the kids were present, so that's a trauma for them. So what on earth perpetrated that? And the first words out of their mouth are generally going to be, well, you know, Ray, she should have, and then fill in the blank. Doesn't matter. Just fill in the blank. She should have had the house cleaned up. She should have had dinner on the table. She should have come home on time. She should have, one should right after another. Anger, resentment, frustration, and now tolerance. Because if she should have done this, and she didn't, now I'm entitled to be angry and frustrated and resentful. Now, flip it around the other way, and you use a should on yourself. That I should have done this, and I should have done that, and I should have spent more time with my kids. I should be thinner. I should be, there's a whole litany of them. You can go down. The emotions that are generated by that cognitive distortion directed at the self creates feelings of shame, guilt, and inadequacy. So when we have should in our thinking and in our speaking, 2 outcomes of it. One way is anger and resentment and entitlement, and the other way is feelings of diminution and feelings of unworthiness and feelings of guilt. I should have spent more time with my son. I should have. I'll give you an example. So I worked with this one unfortunate man whose son had committed suicide. So it was probably a year prior to me seeing him. So he comes in, I introduce myself, he introduces himself, we go through that formality. And I say, well, what can I do for you? How can we work? What is it that you need? And he said, well, my son had committed suicide. And actually used his father's gun to do it. The boy was 19 years old. He had some serious problems going on. And they decided the best way to deal with him was to end his life. Very sad and very tragic. So he told me the whole story, and then he looked at me and he said, now make that better. And my answer to him was, nobody can make that better. Nothing can make that better. I can't make it better. Nobody can. But I can tell you what, there's a lot of ways that you can make it worse and more difficult to recover from. And so tell me, what are your thoughts about it? And the first words out of his mouth were, well, I should have known that he was in more trouble than what I could handle. I should have gotten him help. I should have spent more time with him when he was a child. I should have been a better parent. One should right after another, which is going to make that whole situation worse. So it isn't a matter of making bad situations better. It's about not making them worse than what they are. So with the cognitive distortion of should, there's untold misery with it. That goes with it both ways, to the self and, of course, to others. And again, it distorts the reality when we start using should inappropriately. Now, there's appropriate places to use should, like if my turkey's been in the oven for 3 hours, it should be done. When water gets cold or hot, it should boil or freeze. I mean, those are appropriate places for it. But we find ourselves, and I especially find it with people guilt-ridden, etc., that that should is the primary reason for it. If there's child abuse and domestic violence, very often there's a should that's driving that anger. So what I suggest to people is you eliminate should altogether. Just totally eliminate it. If I were king of the world, I'd make it illegal to use a should, unless, of course, it was related to math or physics. Now, some people say that the should is appropriate in other places too, like we should be kind to other people, and we should be thoughtful, and we should be. But if we're not, then what? Then we're bad people, then we're, so just getting rid of it altogether. Now, I've done many, many professional trainings on this same material, and I would ask a room full of professional therapists and counselors, so if should isn't appropriate and is a distortion of reality, then what is appropriate? And I would tell them this. What I learned from clients is they had much easier times managing anger, guilt, shame, resentment, etc., by using one simple change of phrase, and that is changing should to prefer. Now, I would prefer that everybody treat me kindly and with respect. Doesn't mean that they should. I would prefer that. I would prefer that people drive safely. Doesn't mean that they should. It means that that's simply my preference. Now, there's not a lot of emotional intensity behind preferences. Well, imagine this. Same scenario, a woman comes home from work, the house isn't cleaned up, the kitchen's a mess, they didn't do the dishes, and she comes in the door and she hollers at them, "Damn you kids, I would prefer that you did those dishes and cleaned up the house." Doesn't even make sense, does it? So, if we use prefer, or sometimes it would be in my best interest to do something rather than I should do something, we don't have that same emotional heat that's behind a should. So again, my recommendation is that you get rid of should altogether and replace it with prefer, or it would be in my best interest, or it would be in their best interest, anything rather than a should. So that's one of 15 cognitive distortions. So those cognitive distortions have a tremendous amount of power in creating our emotions. Okay? That's a tough one to grab. That's a tough one for people to wrap their head around, because it seems like it's much easier to blame ourselves or to blame other people, that they should have done this or I should have done that. So it would be in the best interest of your emotional well-being to begin the process of eliminating should. Now, I taught this to my grandson years ago. He's 28 now and in college. He's the one that encouraged me to do this. And he said to me when we were talking about it, he says, "Grandpa," he said, "I'm absolutely should-proof. I don't accept a should from other people, and I don't use should on myself." Well, that's what I'm hoping can happen with some of you, that you just eliminate that altogether from your thinking, and your life will be much, much better just with that one cognitive distortion. Now, the other part is that's difficult for people is to accept that events, situations, people do not create emotions in us. We do it ourselves, and we do it in these ways, with our thoughts, images, fantasy, and meaning that we assign to things. All events are emotionally neutral. There's no emotion with some guy cutting you off in traffic until you think, "God damn him, he should be driving more carefully. He should do," and there you are. So the hardest thing in working with cognitive distortions that I've found with people is accepting the fact that events, situations, people, conditions do not create emotions. Our emotions come from those places. Thoughts, which is why we need to eliminate cognitive distortions from our thoughts. Images, and those are images that just kind of pop into your mind. Like if you, all of a sudden, an image in your mind popped into your mind from a situation that happened in combat, there's emotions connected with that, and they happen real fast, almost so fast that we don't even recognize them. The other place is from fantasy. And I'll tell you a story about that. There was a client I worked with in New Mexico. He had a pretty severe trauma history in childhood. He got fired from his job at a prison because he was way too violent with the other prisoners. In fact, they called him Smash or something like that. So he ended up getting fired from that job. Then he took a job in a Coca-Cola bottling plant, which all he had to do was drive around in a forklift and deliver pallets of Coke to different trucks, etc., etc. Didn't require a lot of interaction with other people, didn't require a lot of thinking or anything like that, just repetitive stuff. And what he would do is he would fantasize his wife having an affair with a milkman or a postman or with some strange man. He would play that fantasy in his mind throughout the entire 8-hour shift. And each time he played that fantasy, he was pumping adrenaline, he was getting more and more angry, and pretty soon he would leave from work, he would go home, and he'd walk in the door filled with anger and rage and resentment at his wife, and began to take it out on her. And she's going, "What are you talking about? I've been home all day. I haven't gone anywhere." But by playing that fantasy over and over and over again, his limbic system can't really tell the difference between a real event and fantasy. And so it keeps pumping him full of cortisol and stress hormones and adrenaline. And pretty soon his jaws are tight and he's madder than hell over a fantasy. Just a fantasy. So when we play those fantasies, whatever they may be, then it changes us, changes our physiology all the way down to the molecular level. And the more we play that fantasy, the more deeply entrenched that belief comes. So fantasy is a very, very powerful way to create emotions. Well, think about this. I use this example much of the time with clients. I tell them, if I were to leave the room and you were to sit here and have a fantasy about a sexual interlude with, Brad Pitt, George Clooney, some man you saw, you would find yourself becoming sexually aroused. And there's nobody else in the room. But our physiology changes with those fantasies. Also, if you were to fantasize the most perfect meal that you could think of, playing that fantasy would cause us to begin to salivate, like we really had the food right in front of us. So we need to be really careful about the fantasies we play. Now, another little sidebar with that is revenge fantasies. Somebody has wronged you because they didn't do what they should or shouldn't or ought to have done. And you play that fantasy in your mind over and over about punching them in the face or burning down their house or doing some crazy ass stuff like that. And every time we play that fantasy, that elevates that stress, that elevates our whole physiology. Our jaws become tight, our muscles become tight, our blood pressure goes up, our heart rate goes up, and it's all based on a fantasy. Now, I had one of those for many, many years. I played this fantasy, and it was got pretty severe. I'm a Vietnam veteran. I've been in a war, so you can imagine what my fantasies were. So I'm working with my vets counselor down in New Mexico, and he asked me, he said, "Ray, play that fantasy just in your mind." And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah, you've done it so many times, you can probably do it pretty fast. So just close your eyes and play this fantasy. And at the end of the fantasy, where your enemy is laying there all beat to crap and you've killed them and chopped them up in little pieces or whatever your fantasy is," he said, "just nod your head when you played that whole fantasy." Well, it only took me about 30 seconds to do that because I'd done it so many times. And he said, "Now ask yourself this question. What now?" Because if we have a revenge fantasy, we tend to play that fantasy right up to the point where we've gotten our revenge. And we stop. We don't go beyond that. We don't go to the consequences of that fantasy. We just stop it right at we've gotten our revenge. And then we play it again and again and again. and our heartbeat, blood pressure, all those stress hormones, they are released again. So there's lots of little tricky stuff that goes with this, but remember, thoughts, images, fantasy, and the other one is meaning. What does it mean to us that this event or this situation occurred? So for example, a combat veteran, they hear a loud noise, bam! What does that mean? That means that it's a serious threat. And so we tend to over-exaggerate the degree of threat in almost every situation. And then we play a fantasy of how we're going to deal with this imaginary threat that more likely isn't going to come true at all. So this is what happens with especially with trauma, that we're creating our emotional stuff. And we very well may be creating the same emotions that went with the traumatic events. So that's with the shoulds. Now, what will probably happen is we'll intertwine these different cognitive distortions throughout the lecture, and but I hope that you get the message that one of the most dangerous ones and one of the most destructive ones is using the word should. And to the best of your ability, it may be in your best interest to see if you can eliminate that cognitive distortion. That's number one. So I'm going to pause for a moment, and then we're going to talk about another emotion or cognitive distortion that also can create a lot of stress. So bear with me.